Ok, dei um instante aqui para todo mundo se conectar. Espero que todos os arranjos tenham sido bem-sucedidos aqui. Bom, vamos oficialmente começar com as apresentações. Eu sou a Carolina Nascimento e eu sou sócia da empresa de consultoria River Global. E a River Global, ela representa o USDEC Export Council na América do Sul. O que é o USDEC Export Council, pessoal? É um conselho de exportadores dos lácteos dos Estados Unidos. Nós trabalhamos para os produtores de leite americanos e a gente não exporta os produtos provenientes do leite, nem os ingredientes, nem os queijos propriamente ditos, mas a gente trabalha para essa indústria processadora e também trabalha com todos vocês aqui na indústria brasileira que querem conhecer mais sobre esses ingredientes, conhecer mais sobre potenciais negócios, mas também toda a parte técnico-científica, de aplicações, de funcionalidades, de desenvolvimento de formulações, e por isso a gente resolveu conduzir essa série de webinars que a gente começou ali em setembro, tá? Bom, hoje eu gostaria de começar falando que a gente vai falar de um assunto muito interessante, tá? A gente vai passar... o tema do webinar de hoje vai ser Usando proteínas lácteas dos Estados Unidos em alimentos e bebidas, funcionalidades e aplicações. Um comentário é que esse webinar, para quem acompanhou os nossos anteriores, vai ser um pouquinho mais longo do que geralmente a gente faz. Ele vai ter quase 2 horas, mas eu garanto para vocês que ele vai ser muito produtivo, tá? Porque a gente vai ter... a gente vai mostrar para vocês algumas demos de aplicação mesmo em laboratório, tá? Bom, continuando com isso, como que a gente vai conduzir agora? Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas para os nossos palestrantes, para as nossas queridas palestrantes do dia. Bom, primeiramente, eu gostaria de falar, dar as boas-vindas para Terry Rexford, e ela trabalha com a gente no UX Export Council. Terry, good morning. Eu também.
Good morning, Carolina.
Oh, good. Good. E eu também gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a Kimberly, ou como carinhosamente a gente chama ela, de KJ Burrington. E ela trabalha no Centro de Pesquisa de Lácteos da Universidade de Wisconsin. KJ, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone.
Good, thank you so much. Antes da gente começar com as apresentações, eu gostaria de fazer uma pequena pergunta para vocês, tá? E a gente tem um pool aqui do Zoom que eu vou lançar agora, mas basicamente a gente quer saber, na opinião de vocês, quais são as categorias de alimentos e bebidas em que vocês veem o maior potencial de desenvolvimento, ou seja, de aplicações de proteínas lácteas, tá? A gente tem algumas opções aqui e deve estar aparecendo na tela de vocês agora. Vamos dar alguns minutinhos para vocês votarem antes da gente começar com as apresentações. Bastante engajamento aqui. Todo mundo acordou super bem hoje, muito bom. Ótimo. Finalizando em 5 segundos, última chance. Maravilha. Então, encerrando. E deixa eu mostrar para vocês os resultados. Muito legal. E o mais legal de tudo isso é que a gente vai abordar todas essas categorias que vocês acabaram de votar, como produtos lácteos e bebidas, principalmente durante o nosso webinar hoje. Maravilha. Então, encerrando aqui a pesquisa. Agora, eu gostaria de proceder para as apresentações. Lembrando a vocês, vai ser um pouquinho mais longo e sigam conosco, mas também lembrem-se, se vocês não falarem inglês ou não estiverem confortáveis, se estiverem um pouco com medo de perder alguma palavra, alguma parte, por favor, acessem essa funcionalidade de interpretação simultânea disponível aqui na barra inferior do Zoom, tá bom? Enjoy e vejo vocês já já.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of our listeners, and thank you for joining the next U.S. Dairy Ingredient Spotlight webinar in our 2020 series. My name is Terry Rexroth, and I work in global marketing for the U.S. Dairy Export Council. We're pleased to offer today's webinar, Using U.S. Dairy Proteins in Foods and Beverages, Functionality and Applications. During the webinar, please enter your questions in the box available on your screen, and at the end, we will host a Q&A session. We will answer as many questions as possible, time permitting, and all unanswered questions will be addressed by email after the webinar. First, a little about USDEC for those who may not be familiar with us. We are a nonprofit, membership organization working on behalf of U.S. dairy farmers. Since USDEC was founded in 1995, U.S. dairy exports have increased sevenfold to nearly $5.6 billion annually. In 2019, the U.S. dairy industry exported the equivalent of nearly 16% of U.S. milk solids. We have offices located in export markets around the world, across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Our global team is focused on building demand for dairy ingredients and cheese. And now I'd like to welcome today's speaker, KJ Burrington, the Dairy Ingredient Applications Program Coordinator for the Wisconsin Center for Dairy Research. In this role, KJ provides technical support to U.S. dairy processors and food companies on dairy ingredient functionality and applications, cultured products, and beverages. Today, she'll review the composition and functionality of U.S. dairy ingredients, especially dairy proteins. She'll simplify this complex topic with clear explanations, plus a few fun and informative demonstrations. Welcome, KJ.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to talk about innovative uses of dairy ingredients in food and beverage applications. We'll talk about dairy ingredient composition, functionality, and we'll take a look at several different applications: dairy beverages, yogurt, frozen desserts, bakery, confections, and nutrition bars. Here is our list of dairy ingredients. On the left, we have our milk ingredients, and on the right, our whey ingredients. We'll go into each of these into a little bit more detail. This isn't by far an exhaustive list, but it gives you a good list of ingredients to work from for your functional needs as well as your nutritional needs. Starting with whey ingredients, you'll see on the left we have an ingredient called dairy product solids. This ingredient represents our permeate ingredients. So when you make a whey protein ingredient, and usually we make these by the process of ultrafiltration, that ultrafiltration will concentrate the protein and the fat, and it will remove the lactose and minerals. And that product then becomes the permeate, because those components actually permeate the ultrafiltration membrane. So you'll see that the dairy product solids is the name that the US has chosen to call this ingredient. But you'll see several other names that are used on product labels within the US. And I've given you some examples of those on the slide. Permeate ingredients are very low in protein generally, but very high in lactose. Sweet whey contains protein, real intact protein, and usually around 13%, but it is also still high in lactose and minerals. When you use an ultrafiltration membrane, you can concentrate the protein and fat, and it will to make an ingredient like whey protein concentrate with 34% protein, or whey protein concentrate with 80% protein, or a whey protein isolate. So you will see commonly acronyms like WPC, which stands for whey protein concentrate, and WPI, which stands for whey protein isolate. In the process of ultrafiltration, you'll see the protein increases and the lactose and minerals decrease. Taking a look at permeate all by itself, we have a couple of different ingredients that we will call permeate ingredients. One comes from milk, and it's called milk permeate, and the other comes from whey, and it's called whey permeate. So just as I explained, in the process of making a high-protein milk ingredient, like a milk protein concentrate or isolate, we have another co-product called milk permeate. And whey permeate, of course, comes from the ultrafiltration of whey. You'll see the composition of these are both very similar. And the main difference between these two is the source of the ingredient and also the flavor. So the milk permeate ingredients, because they're coming from skim milk, typically will have a very milky flavor. A whey ingredient, because it comes from whey, which comes from the manufactured cheese, will have more of a whey flavor or more flavors that come from the cultures that are used in the cheese making. And those are some of the key differences. The other differences will be whey, because whey tends to be more tan in color, the whey permeate ingredients will also be more tan in color, while milk permeate tends to be more white. I've broken out the composition of the minerals for each of these, and it's mainly because there's some really valuable dairy minerals that we find in milk permeate and whey permeate. You'll see that both of them have sodium, high levels of calcium, high levels of potassium, and also some magnesium. Here you'll see some differences as well. Whey permeate tends to have a higher sodium content, but it is more similar when it comes to the calcium, potassium, and magnesium content. Milk protein ingredients, we have a wide number of milk protein ingredients that range in protein from 40% all the way up to almost 90%. And the products that are less than 90% protein are typically called milk protein concentrates, and the one that is the closest to 90% protein we typically call milk protein isolate. So you'll notice here as well, as you go up in protein, you're going to go down in lactose. These products are also made by ultrafiltration. In this case, we're ultrafiltering milk. And as we remove more lactose and minerals, we are able to increase the protein content. One difference that you'll notice here compared to the whey ingredients is that you do reduce the mineral content or the ash content, some as you increase in protein, but not dramatic decreases. And that's because the calcium that's in milk, much of it is associated with the casein micelle. So even though these are ultrafiltered and maybe diafiltered to a very high protein content, the calcium and the overall mineral composition stays very high. Now, micellar casein, you'll notice, has very similar protein levels that milk protein concentrate does. There is one difference here, though. If we take a look at the protein composition of milk, the ratio of casein to whey protein in milk is about 80% casein and 20% whey protein. So all of the milk protein concentrates and isolates will have that ratio of casein to whey protein. Micellar casein, on the other hand, is made by processing milk through a microfiltration membrane. And that membrane has the ability to concentrate the casein and to remove more whey protein. So we can create an ingredient that typically will have 90% casein and 10% whey protein, or maybe even as high as 95% casein and 5% whey protein. So you have the ability to make a very high protein ingredient, but something that's actually very high in casein. If we take a look at the co-product of this microfiltration, the co-product would be a milk whey protein. And there's, if you've noticed in these slides, that these are mostly industry standards. So in the United States, we don't have a Code of Federal Regulations standard for some of our milk protein ingredients, but we do have an industry standard, and that's been put together by the American Dairy Products Institute, specifically so customers that are buying these ingredients will have an idea of what the composition should be. For our milk whey protein standards, these ingredients can range from 34% protein all the way up to 90% protein. And in the US, we have more manufacturers of these ingredients as well. We have two now that are taking the co-product of this microfiltered milk and actually drying it into a milk-derived whey protein. So you might ask, what's different about this product? Well, it came from milk, first of all. So this product also does not have the same characteristic whey flavors that a whey protein concentrate or isolate will have. It has a very clean flavor. It also, because it's very low in fat, more typical of what a whey protein isolate would have, it's a very clear product. So it can be used in clear beverages for that purpose. It also has a unique protein composition. It doesn't come from cheese making, so it has one of its protein components missing that you would have in a whey protein isolate made from cheese. And that main component is glycomacropeptide. So this protein does not have, this whey protein does not contain that specific whey protein, which makes it unique. Here are the functional properties of milk proteins. So we're going to talk about these because the functional properties of these proteins have a lot to do with the performance in your product. And it also helps you to choose which protein you might like to have, because one of these might perform better than the other one in your particular application. So if you can understand the basics of functional properties of milk proteins, you're well on your way to helping you choose the right ingredient. Caseins, we know, are very good at fat emulsification. We know that they also foam. They are very soluble as long as your pH is above 6. They're very good at water binding, and we do know from cheese manufacture that they precipitate in the presence of chymosin, and in the presence of calcium, because that's how we make cheese. We also know that caseins are very heat stable. Most of us have boiled milk before and won't notice any major visible changes to the milk. It won't curdle, it won't precipitate. So that's because casein is very heat stable. Whey proteins, on the other hand, are very good at gelling. So if we have enough concentration in solution and we actually heat it, it will gel. Milk proteins, we know, don't gel under those circumstances, and the only way we can get a milk protein to gel is if we put it through an acidification process. So in other words, if you make cheese or if you make yogurt, that actually is what we would call an acid gel. So though it's gelation, it's a different kind of gelation. Whey proteins are very good at foaming, and the unique property that whey proteins have is they're soluble at almost any pH. But we also know that they're very heat sensitive. They do change with heat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Some of the other components that we will find in our ingredients are milk, fat, and lactose. So it's important to know what their functionality is, because most of these whey ingredients and milk ingredients contain more than just protein. Milk fat, most of us are familiar with, And we think about milk fat in terms of air incorporation. Milk fat in ice cream, for instance, helps us to incorporate air into ice cream. We use milk fat like butter, it has creaming properties. And of course, flavor. We think of butter as having a really nice flavor. But there's a lot of other things that contribute from milk fat for a functional purpose. In our dairy ingredients, we don't usually have a lot of milk fat in them, so they don't maybe contribute the same properties as butter might, but they will still contribute mouthfeel. They'll still contribute some creaminess, and they also will give kind of a milky appearance to products like beverages. Lactose, of course, is our milk sugar, and lactose is sweet, but it's much less sweet than sucrose. So it typically has about 20% of the sweetness of sucrose. Lactose has humectant properties. We know that it participates in the browning reaction, specifically the Maillard browning reaction. So if you have the presence of protein and reducing sugar like lactose, you'll get some browning. Lactose suppresses sucrose crystallization, and it also is a pretty good free flow agent. We should talk a little bit about denaturation, and this usually is in reference to whey protein. As we mentioned, whey protein is heat sensitive. So what that means is that it does change in a heating situation. And we have a couple of graphics here. So one is an egg. So if you think of an egg, as you are cooking an egg, you are actually creating denaturation of the albumin in the egg. And that denaturation eventually leads to gelation, right? So you can do the same thing with a whey protein. And the graphic below that shows you that when you start with a native whey protein, it's in a very folded globular state. And the first thing that will happen when you heat a whey protein solution is that whey protein will sort of unfold in its structure. And that unfolding actually exposes both water binding sites as well as other sites like free sulfhydryl groups that can interact with other whey proteins and form disulfide bonds. So this reaction takes place the longer the product is heated and the higher the amount of whey protein in it. And eventually, and we'll use a beverage again as an example, you have enough whey protein in solution and enough heat that those linkages will start to form. And when you get settling in a beverage, in a protein beverage, it's often because there's enough of that denaturation taking place and the molecules have gotten big enough that they fall out of solution. The other extreme example would be if you, of course, have very high levels of whey protein, so maybe more than 10%, you can actually form a gel in that beverage. And then you have sort of a solid gel in the bottom of your bottle, both of which are not desired attributes at all. So there are always some tricks to help avoid denaturation. And that's why I always say, when you're using whey protein, you have to treat it a little with tender loving care because it can't be exposed to any kind of condition and still remain soluble in that solution. Now, if our whey proteins are in the presence of milk protein, like casein, and in this case, this would happen in milk. If you are heating milk, the whey proteins will do the same thing. So they will unfold, but they will be in the presence of casein. So they have the ability then to form a disulfide bond with casein protein. And when they do that, actually that improves the heat stability of whey protein. We call it a chaperoning effect. And this is used quite a lot in dairy protein beverages. which helps to give the product better heat stability and overall better product stability. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later in our presentation, but we use this chemistry of milk and this interaction of whey protein caseins a lot in our dairy processing and our dairy products. A couple of examples are medium heat and high heat milk powders. This is the very same reaction that we use to create those milk powders. We also use this reaction in yogurt, and both of those modify the functional properties of either the milk powder and also the yogurt by giving them both better water binding ability. So you could see how a high heat or medium heat milk powder would provide better functionality in this method. It also, in the case of the high heat milk powder, it gives the product more heat stability because you've created this interaction between the casein and whey protein. So just something to think about as we talk a little bit more about our applications. One of the keys to using dairy proteins, either whether it's a whey protein or whether it's a milk protein, one of the keys is hydration. We are always starting with powders, and those powders need to be hydrated in a way to create good hydration and good functionality. So for whey protein and milk protein, you're going to use a high-speed mixer because that's the best way to get them wetted and mixed well in solution. And in most manufacturing plants, you'll have something like a liquefier or a tri-blender to do that process. Now, with whey proteins, there's a couple of cautions here. A lot of agitation for a long time for a whey protein is not good for the whey protein because you will create a lot of foam. And that foam, of course, is not easy to work with. You can't pump it, you can't move it around. You'll get some product losses if you've created a lot of foam. So most companies will use defoamers in that case, and they're allowed, probably in most countries. In the US, they're allowed as a processing aid, so that we have food-grade defoamers that can help depress that foam so you don't create it in the first place. It's also important to not agitate too much because you'll denature the whey protein. If you mix too long at high speeds, you'll pre-denature that whey protein. And if you are trying to make a high acid beverage, that denatured whey protein will not have good solubility, and you will lose that from precipitation in the beverage. The other thing to be concerned with is to keep the temperature low, lower than 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius, so you also don't pre-denature the whey proteins prior to use. For milk proteins, on the other hand, our concern is not so much denaturation, and shearing is not such a problem, though you can create foam with milk proteins as well. Typically, our issue with milk protein concentrates and isolates, especially for those that are higher than 70% protein, these are very slow to hydrate. So even though you will mix them with a high-speed mixer, they can take 12 hours or more to hydrate at cold temperatures. So the easiest thing to do to optimize the hydration conditions is to warm up the milk or warm up the water to about 50 degrees C, and then it should only take about an hour. In our next video, we're actually going to talk about some more specific functional properties, and we're going to talk about foaming to give you an idea of how different ingredients perform based on foaming.
In this demonstration, we're going to demonstrate the foaming properties of 4 different ingredients. And you might ask yourself, well, why is foaming important? Well, foaming is important for a number of applications. If you think about making a cake or making ice cream or making a whipped topping, aeration and the ability for the protein to unfold and form an interface at the air and water interface is really important. And for some applications, it's especially important, whereas for other applications, foaming might be a detriment, for instance, in a beverage application. All of these ingredients have to be typically rehydrated, and we're using high-speed mixers to do that. And often you're going to generate a lot of foam when you do that. So it's important to kind of understand which of these ingredients will foam under those conditions and which one won't. We have skim milk powder, which of course is just dried skim milk. And this has a ratio of about 80% casein and 20% whey protein. So you have a combination of proteins. Altogether, they're about 35% protein. Our next ingredient will be a whey protein concentrate 34. This has about the same level of protein as a skim milk powder. So they're both going to be about 34% protein or 35% protein. And the next ingredient is a milk protein isolate. And this, of course, is a very high protein ingredient, has 90% of the protein on a dry basis. And it also is a combination of casein and whey protein. And our last ingredient is a whey protein isolate. And of course, this is all whey protein, about 90% protein on a dry basis. So you have two ingredients, the WPC and the WPI, that are all whey protein, and two ingredients that are a combination of casein and whey protein. So you're going to get to see how they differ in their foaming properties. The method that we're using today is a very simple method. We're just going to use a blender and blend them for each for about 30 seconds, which will give you an idea of how they compare. We've also adjusted all of them to the same level of protein, 10% protein. So you're going to use different amounts of each ingredient to get to that 10% protein. So we'll start with our skim milk powder. In all of these solutions we're making, we're starting with about 200 milliliters of solution between the ingredient and the water. So we're going to measure overrun by looking at the final level after we've mixed it. In this case, we have about 270 milliliters, and we started at 200. So to calculate our overrun, we'll take 270 divided by 200, and we'll divide it by 200, and that will give us our percent overrun. So for each of these ingredients, we'll do the same thing, and then we can kind of compare how much overrun they're getting. Our next ingredient is whey protein concentrate with 34% protein, or WPC 34. So you will notice that our whey protein ingredient foamed quite a bit more than the skim milk powder did. In fact, we're at about 410 milliliters. So we have almost twice the amount of foam developed with this product. So if you were going to choose an ingredient that will help create more foaming ability, I would use a whey protein concentrate. Our next ingredient is milk protein isolate. And you will remember now that this also has about 80% casein and 20% whey protein. It has a much higher level of protein, but remember we've kept all of the protein concentrations the same at 10%. So if we look at our milk protein isolate foaming ability, it's actually very similar in this case to the skim milk powder. So we have some foam, but we don't have a lot of foam that's generated. Our last ingredient is whey protein isolate. So remember, this ingredient has only whey protein, no casein. So we'll see how this compares with all of the other ingredients. So, as you might expect, this one is very foamy. In fact, we can't get all of the product into this cylinder. So our winner is the whey protein isolate. But if you think about how whey protein isolates are used, they're often used in high acid beverages. So for a beverage application, this foaming is not a positive attribute. And in most cases, companies will have to use a food-grade defoamer to break up that foam. But the good thing is that it doesn't take very much, usually 0.001% defoamer, and you will have complete collapse of this foam. So it's a very common thing for protein beverage manufacturers to use to help prevent this. If you really didn't do anything with this, you can imagine trying to make a beverage out of it and pumping it through all of your lines and filling your bottles. You'd end up filling a bottle that has a lot of foam in it, and eventually it's going to collapse. And the weight of the bottle won't be high enough, and then the volume will be too low as well once the consumer receives it. So you don't want foaming to be a part of your beverage. But the reason that it's doing so well is that, again, this ingredient doesn't have any fat. So fat is always going to depress foaming. And because whey proteins are so good in a mixer condition like this, they're getting unfolded because of the shearing of the mixer. And that unfolding is helping them align themselves at that air-water interface. So they make a very stable foam. The other thing we can measure when we do foamability is foam stability. So you'll see now that some of these foams are starting to collapse. And the way we measure foam stability is by measuring the amount of foam that collapses for a specific amount of time, say 30 minutes. And you'll see that the skim milk powder has already collapsed some, the WPC 34 has already collapsed some, and though it's hard to see, the milk protein isolate has also collapsed, and you're going to see it from the bottom up. This product, the whey protein isolate, is the most, has the most foam, but it also will make the most stable foam for all of the ingredients. So keep in mind, this is a very simple way to measure foaming. It's straightforward. You can use a blender. It goes very quickly. You'll find other ways of measuring foaming in the literature that are much more sophisticated. But for the purposes of a demonstration, this goes very quickly and it's very visual. So we use this quite often to help people understand the differences in functionality between milk proteins and whey proteins ingredients.
Let's talk about beverages as our first application area. We have many opportunities to put dairy ingredients in beverages. And in the US, I would say you will find beverages in all of these categories that will have protein added to them. In my time at the Center for Dairy Research, I think we have worked on every single category that's listed here and put whey protein in them to see how it would perform and see how it would taste. So there are some ways to do that. And there are some important factors to consider when we are trying to use dairy protein in a beverage application. So the first thing to pay attention to is something we've already talked about, and that's hydration conditions and time. Remember that good hydration always means better heat stability and better performance. So that means initially in the beverage, but as well as through the entire shelf life of the beverage. pH is also very important because pH gives us the guideline for helping us to choose whether we want milk protein, which will have predominantly casein, or whether we want to use a whey protein, which of course is all whey protein. So it's important to understand how each of these behave in different pH environments. Ionic strength. So ionic strength is really what is the ionic environment like? And the ionic environment means the mineral content. Specifically, the divalent minerals have probably the most impact on the ionic environment. And that means things like calcium and magnesium tend to be more reactive. So if you have a very high ionic strength, there's a greater possibility for protein-to-protein interactions. And then that means you have a greater chance for protein instability in your beverage. So always be aware of what's the ionic strength of your beverage. And then lastly would be the protein concentration. So as most of you already know and suspect, the higher you go in protein, the more challenging the product will be in terms of its stability and overall performance. So next you'll see a video that talks about how the different milk proteins and whey proteins will behave in different pH environments.
In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at the differences in solubility at different pH between a milk protein ingredient, milk protein isolate, and a whey protein isolate. If we start with the milk protein isolate, this product has about 90% protein on a dry basis, but the protein components are made of casein and whey protein. So you have about 80% of the protein is casein and about 20% as whey protein. At the natural pH, milk protein isolate is usually around 6.8 to 7, and it's very milky looking, very cloudy. This is typically how we would expect it to look. Now, if we change the pH of the solution and we drop it to pH 4.6, we see that there's a lot of small curd at the bottom of this container. And that curd is precipitated casein. So what we've done is we've adjusted the pH to the isoelectric point of most of the casein proteins. And in doing that, we've solubilized the calcium. It comes away from the casein micelle, and it creates this attractive force between the casein molecules. And they come together and form aggregates. So in a sense, we've kind of made some cheese here by direct acidification. In this solution, we've taken that same milk protein isolate and we've adjusted it to pH 3. And this also has some very tiny curd in it, and it's almost gelled at this point. So it's also, again, not a very good pH condition for good casein solubility. If we look at our whey protein isolate in solution, the natural pH is about 6.2 to 6.3. So it's relatively clear, but it still has some cloudiness. And this is going to be very typical of most whey protein isolates. If we do the same thing with this product and we adjust the pH to 4.6 using phosphoric acid, you'll notice that there's a difference in appearance. So the pH 4.6 is more cloudy. And I'll explain to you why that is. At pH 4.6, we now have many of the molecules not only have positive, but they also have some negative charges on them. And that means that there are more attractive forces between the whey protein molecules. So they will actually come together, and to your eye, it makes the solution look more cloudy. If we do the same thing that we did with the milk protein isolate and we adjust it down to pH 3, a quite different appearance shows up. In this case, we have a very clear appearance, which is a really unusual thing for a food protein, but a very nice thing about whey protein isolates. The reason that it's clear is because this solution now is very highly positively charged. You have a lot of repulsive forces instead of attractive forces between the molecules, and it makes that solution look very clear to the naked eye. The other reason it's clear is because a whey protein isolate doesn't have any fat in it. So fat will make this solution look much more cloudy. If we did it with a whey protein concentrate with 80% protein, which has about 6% fat, it would be very milky looking, very cloudy. But this is the nice property for whey protein isolate, and this is really the reason why now we have all kinds of protein waters on the market, because you can make a protein enhanced water at pH 3 very clear. So if you can kind of understand the differences between the solubility of milk proteins and whey proteins, it helps you to select the ingredient. So now you know that whey proteins are probably going to be much more soluble at low pHs than a milk protein is. So if you're working in the application areas of high acid beverages, whey protein isolate is always going to be a better choice. In terms of heat stability as well, whey proteins are rather heat sensitive, but at pH 3, they're going to have really good heat stability. And that's another reason why it's very easy to formulate with whey protein isolate in high acid beverages.
So let's think about how we're going to choose our ingredients. Now that you know a little bit more about them, you are going to pick them based on their composition, for one, because the composition will dictate the functionality, but it will also contribute to your overall nutrition of your product. So think about that. If you are trying to make, in this case, a beverage, the pH of the beverage is very important. We know now that each of those proteins behaves differently at different pH. So the pH that you choose is going to kind of help you to choose whether you want a milk protein or a whey protein. Also remember the solubility characteristics of casein and whey proteins at different pH. So you've learned a little bit about that. And then we need to think about the type of heat processing, because we know now that caseins are very heat stable and whey proteins are more heat sensitive. We're going to start with low acid beverages. So these are the beverages that would have typically a pH between 6.5 and 7. And you have the ability to process these by high temperature short time, ultra high temperature processing, or maybe even retort processing. Most of these are going to be a combination of milk proteins and whey proteins. And especially in the case of ultra high temperature and retort beverages, that will be the case. Because remember, those are much higher heat processes. It's difficult to reach 10% protein oftentimes in these applications. So sometimes you'll see companies that have tried to use hydrolyzed whey proteins, because those will be more heat stable. They could help there too. We're going to think about We probably will need a stabilizer in this case, and we'll probably need to use a homogenization, and we're definitely going to need to use some buffers in this system. So we'll talk a little bit about that. When we think about the processing steps, and in this case, we're going to use an ultra-high temperature process, for an example. We're going to mix our milk protein, and if we decide to have a little whey protein in there, we'll mix them together with a high-speed mixer, and we will use that 50 degrees C temperature, and we'll give them about an hour of hydration. Now, it is still possible to add some other ingredients in with the protein ingredient during this hydration time, so that does give you a little bit more flexibility. And you'll find some companies will then add their buffers to adjust the pH. We do have examples of companies that will add the buffers first. So you can see what works better for your system. But those buffers then are used, and you might use pH adjusting ingredients as well, to adjust pH 6.8 to 7 typically. So then you're going to heat process at about 140 degrees centigrade for maybe 3 to 6 seconds. You'll homogenize afterwards because in a UHT system, that's typically what is done. And then the product, of course, is filled at ambient temperature. And in most cases here, if you're filling aseptically, then you would have an aseptic product. Here's some examples of low acid beverages. So these have different levels of protein. They're used for different age groups, I'll say, as well as different need states or different consumers. So we have a product here with 12 grams of protein. That's for children on the left. On the far right in the top, we have this boost product, which is usually targeted for, I would say, older people as a meal replacement beverage. The product at the bottom, the Kellogg product, is actually targeted for weight management. So for people, and often in this case it would be women, the Kellogg brand is very female focused. The muscle milk, of course, is more focused to athletes and very active people. And then the product at the bottom on the left is actually a protein-enhanced coffee, which I would say is for sort of general health and wellness and people that like coffee and would like something with a little higher protein. So lots of opportunities here and lots of different levels of protein. If we go to our high acid beverages, now we have a couple of different categories of high acid beverages. Here, the pH is between 2.8 and 3.5. And I've chosen that because you can actually make a beverage in this category without any added stabilizers or buffers or actually very few ingredients. So most of these are going to be hot fill or UHT. And in the US, most of the time we see these as hot fill beverages. You're going to definitely use whey protein. You learned by now that whey proteins have much better solubility in this kind of an environment. Fat will increase the cloudiness, but if you use a whey protein isolate, you can make a product that's very clear. The clarity will be very good. The astringency will be kind of high because whey protein at very low pH is going to, it will give you some astringency or some mouth drying on your tongue. But it's very possible to do a product that's as high as 10% protein at pH 3 under hot fill conditions. And the reason is something you know now based on our demonstration, because at pH 3, the whey proteins are very highly positively charged and very heat stable. So the typical processing steps are very straightforward in this category. You're going to hydrate your whey protein with a high-speed mixer. Whey proteins generally are going to have good performance even if you hydrate them for only 20 to 30 minutes. You'll get very good clarity and very good heat stability under those conditions. Then you can add all your other ingredients, your sweeteners, your colors, and your flavors at the same time. Then add your pH adjusting ingredients such as your acids. And then you can heat process to 82°C for about 2 minutes and cool, which is a typical hot fill process. Here's some examples of our high acid drinks that fit into this pH category. These, again, very different levels of protein. Some are designed for very active people or athletes. Some of them, like the Ensure product, was designed again for the older population. The product actually in the middle is called Rapid Whey. This was a product that we developed specifically for our athletic department. It contains 100% cherry juice with added whey protein isolate, and they use it for as a recovery drink. So the cherries are very naturally high in potassium. Cherries also are very high in phytosterols, and those are known to have anti-inflammatory properties. So between having a product that's good for inflammation as well as good for muscle recovery is a nice opportunity for somebody that's an athlete. Now, most of these are going to be hot fill, and our next category is actually pH 3.5 to 4.5. So this is still high acid, but a little higher in pH. And I break these out because once you get over the pH of 3.5 for whey protein, because you have some added negative charges now, so you don't have a solution full of positively charged molecules, you have some negative charges now too. So you have more opportunities for interactions. So the way that we do work with this ingredient is we usually add pectin, and that pectin helps to interact with the whey protein, so it can get in between the whey proteins and prevent the whey proteins from forming disulfide bonds, creating more instability, and prevent them from separating out. So the pectin actually helps to improve their heat stability and solubility at that pH range. So here are our processing steps. And in this case, again, we're going to hydrate this whey protein, and we typically can just use ambient temperature water. We can add our other sweeteners, colors, and flavors, and then we're going to hydrate for maybe up to 30 minutes with slow agitation. And then we will add our high methoxypectin to that solution. And typically that's dissolved in very hot water. But once you do that, you can combine that with the other ingredients, add your acids, and then we will homogenize this product typically, because that homogenization step will help to interact the high methoxypectin with the whey protein and make that reaction and interaction much more efficient. And then you can proceed with your hot fill process, so about 82°C for 2 minutes. Here are a few examples of the pH 3.5 to 4.5 drinks. So again, these are for different consumer needs. They have different levels of protein and very different flavor profiles. So very good opportunities to make a unique product here for somebody. We can even use permeate in beverages. So I wanted to cover that a little bit. Remember, permeate provides quite a bit of nutrition because of its high mineral content. And of course, it's a very clean label product as well. If you imagine adding all of those minerals in the chemical form, it's going to add a lot of ingredients to your ingredient logic. So providing that in one ingredient, which are all naturally occurring, is a very positive thing. Lactose, of course, also provides energy. When you want to make a dry mix beverage, permeate becomes a very good flow agent, so it's very flowable. And in some cases, it's also going to help enhance flavor. In ready-to-drink beverages or even yogurt drinks, you can actually hydrolyze the lactose in those products. So if your interest is to create more sweetness, which it will also allow you to add less sugar. So it's a nice opportunity to make a product that maybe has reduced added sugar. Or you can also say that it's lactose-free. Here's one example of an application that we have done using milk permeate in this case. It's a very simple dry mix kind of an application. And you'll see that it's only got sugar, a little bit of malic acid, and some natural lemon flavor. And you have some high levels of sodium and potassium in this product. So if you think about an isotonic beverage, for instance, usually you're providing sodium and potassium to help replenish those minerals that you lose or electrolytes that you lose through sweating. So this product brings those to this drink in a very natural way through the permeate or dairy product solids. Here's some other examples of beverages that use permeate. These are some from the U.S., some from outside of the U.S. Some are hot beverages, some are cold beverages. A couple of these are even drinkable yogurts. So there's lots of opportunities for companies to use permeate in a beverage application. Let's change to yogurt products. So in the yogurt product world, we have a lot of opportunities as well, just like in the beverage world. And we at the center have actually put dairy proteins and other dairy ingredients in just about all of these categories too. So let's talk a little bit more about how to do that. When we're thinking about an ingredient for yogurt, we'd love that product, of course, to have a low cost with a high level of functionality. We'd like something that's easily incorporated, something maybe even to help develop the viscosity of the yogurt or the gelation of the yogurt, something that helps improve the texture and consistency. Definitely want something that doesn't have any off flavors. And in yogurt, we always are looking for things that help reduce syneresis, or that weighing off that can occur commonly with yogurt products. So hydration is going to be important in yogurt also. And the main reason is we are going to prevent a couple of common defects. If we hydrate our whey protein and hydrate our milk protein ingredients, especially under the conditions that you've already learned about, we can prevent such things as graininess, which means we have a problem with our protein solubility in our yogurt, and we can help avoid syneresis. So we're trying to really get that dairy protein to work well for us. And if we haven't hydrated it well, it's not going to help prevent that syneresis. And so we're really not giving it the optimal conditions to perform well. So just remember, good hydration here also means good performance. So how do we choose in this kind of application? So I put together a little table that talks about the pros and cons, or the advantages and disadvantages of using a whey protein or a milk protein in yogurt. So very briefly, the whey proteins, we know they take less time to hydrate. They're actually very good at preventing syneresis because they're going to create that interaction with casein. So remember, we do that in yogurt. We heat yogurt up to a very high temperature, at least the mix, usually 85 degrees centigrade or higher, and maybe for 5 to 10 minutes. And specifically to create that casein and whey protein interaction, which is going to help us prevent syneresis in that finished yogurt. It's going to help improve the water binding ability. And adding whey protein to that also helps improve that. We're going to help increase viscosity a little bit. We'll get a shorter gelation time. But if we use milk protein, we're going to get a very clean taste, flavor. We're going to get a very white color. Remember, whey is not usually white. And if we add more casein to the yogurt mix, we're going to get a firmer gel, because casein is really the basis of a yogurt gel. So what are the disadvantages of using whey protein? So if you use a lot of whey protein, you're going to get a more tan color. You'll get more whey flavor. You might get a grainy and weak texture, actually, if you add too much, because if you add a lot of whey protein, say for instance you have more whey protein than casein in your yogurt mix, and you use the same heating conditions, so 85°C for 5 to 7 minutes or more, you're going to get a grainy texture because the heating is way too high for whey protein. Remember, because of that heat sensitivity. If we use milk protein, on the other hand, it is going to take longer to hydrate. So for some people, that could be a disadvantage. And if you don't hydrate it well enough, it will get very grainy on you. And sometimes it can get too firm, because if you're adding a lot of milk protein, you're going to get a really, really firm texture. And for some consumers, the texture might actually be too firm. Here's some examples of some of our high-protein yogurts. And these are actually different combinations of protein ingredients. So the one on the left actually uses ultra-filtered milk. So they did not start with a powder ingredient and add it to their milk. They actually started with fluid milk that they processed through an ultrafiltration membrane. So the protein starts out as higher. The middle one is a high protein yogurt that uses milk protein concentrate to increase the protein content. And the one on the right actually uses a combination of milk protein concentrate and whey protein concentrate. So texture-wise, the two on the left are actually very firm and very white. And the one on the right is actually a little less firm because they use some whey protein, and it's also a little bit more tan because they used whey protein. So you can use kind of these combinations to really customize the texture of the yogurt that you want. Here's some commercial products that use milk protein concentrate. So just to give you an idea that there are other countries and other products that already utilize milk protein concentrate in their yogurt products. Some of these are higher in protein, but some of them are not. So they might be using them at low levels, so maybe 2%, maybe addition, and you're going to get some good functionality out of that at lower levels. Here are some yogurts that use whey protein concentrate. Again, we find yogurts from different countries, and in most cases, these products are using the whey protein concentrate for a functional purpose. So think about that in terms of replacing things like starches and gums, products that maybe are not as clean label. You could use a whey protein concentrate and get some of that same functionality. I have an example here of in this case, it's a cucumber lemon yogurt drink. So this is a drinkable yogurt that we worked on some years ago. And this is a kind of a unique opportunity because it's more of a savory yogurt drink. And it's actually had a very refreshing flavor. We used milk permeate in this case to add some nice dairy minerals. Add some of those things we talked about, like increasing the potassium content and the sodium content. We used non-fat dry milk in this too. So think about this as just a unique opportunity maybe to use permeate in a yogurt drink. And the permeate actually gave it some salty character. So that's one of the things you'll notice because of the high ash content. It's actually because of the potassium content in permeate can give some salty characteristics to an application. So for this product, it was actually a very good addition because if you're trying to make more of a savory product, it helps to give some saltiness as well as enhance some savory flavors. This product is actually a coffee yogurt frappe, or it was a coffee flavored drinkable yogurt. And here we used a whey protein concentrate with 80% protein. And the reason we chose whey protein concentrate is we were trying to enhance the protein content of a drinkable yogurt. And remember what I said about the casein creating a much more firm texture. It's actually much more difficult to make a protein enhanced drinkable yogurt with milk protein concentrate because it has a tendency to want to really increase the viscosity of the yogurt. So here we used a whey protein to add a little bit more protein content to this particular drinkable yogurt. You'll also notice we added a lactase enzyme because we were trying to create sweetness without adding sugar. And in this case, we just used a little bit of stevia to increase the sweetness without adding a lot of, obviously we're not adding any sugar or calories by doing that. So the lactase enzyme naturally breaks up the lactose into glucose and galactose. So it's a really nice opportunity to make a product that's lactose free as well as a product that's more sweet. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about bakery applications. And we have a lot of opportunities in bakery to use whey, to use permeate, to use whey protein concentrate. And there are many products over the years that have used these ingredients to provide flavor because of browning reactions, to provide improved texture and softness of the crumb, to decrease the dough time, to add also a nice brown color. And we've also used permeate especially to help with sodium reduction. Remember I told you that permeate has this salty characteristic because of the potassium. And that potassium can replace some of the salty characteristics in a reduced sodium product and make a product that also has just enhanced flavor in general. So some really nice opportunities there. Our whey protein concentrate, on the other hand, can provide crumb softening, color, and flavor. We've also used whey protein concentrate quite a bit for either fat replacement or egg replacement. So in the case of countries that experience bird flu, for instance, and even the United States had this issue a few years ago, we had many different people looking for whey protein ingredients because there was a real egg shortage. And we fortunately have done quite a bit of work over time to talk about egg replacement. And whey protein concentrate is a perfect opportunity to do that. I'd like to go over just some of the advantages of permeate a little bit more, especially in the baked area, but in general. We have used permeate in baked products to help reduce the overall formula cost. Most of the time when you're using permeate to replace other ingredients, and these would mainly be other macro ingredients like the carbohydrate-based ingredients or maybe some of the other protein-based ingredients or just flour, permeate provides some cost reduction opportunities. We have used it to replace other carbohydrates, so things like maltodextrin or dextrose, some carbohydrates that may not be quite as clean label. We've used permeate to do that. We've even done partial replacement of dairy ingredients from time to time. Whole milk powders and skim milk powders can be of course, more expensive than permeate. So a partial replacement of those could be a real opportunity. And even sometimes for sweet whey, because sometimes sweet whey is not as available as our whey permeate ingredients are. Nutritional applications, we've already talked about. There's some real opportunities to bring in the dairy minerals from permeate, provide more nutrition. And then sodium reduction, as I mentioned. A nice opportunity because of the salty characteristics of permeate and the high potassium content can often help replace sodium in many different applications, not just bakery. And because of the flavor enhancement we often see with permeate, you might be able to replace or reduce the cocoa content or maybe some other more expensive flavors that you're using. Here are some examples of some baked products and some soups and a couple of seasonings that we've done where we've used whey permeate to help reduce sodium. And just as a rule of thumb, typically 10 to 11 grams of permeate will replace 1 gram of salt. So you think, my gosh, that's a lot of permeate. Well, obviously, you wouldn't have expected a 1-to-1 replacement for salt because that would have not made sense. You have a lot of lactose also in permeate, so that lactose can help replace some of the macro ingredients as we talked about. So some of the sugars, some of the flours, some of the fat. So you can help reduce some of those macro ingredients, maybe some of the cocoa, maybe some of the flavors to help you replace the salt. And we've been able to make pretty sizable sodium reductions in some of these products. The whole egg replacement approach, as I told you about, typically you're going to try to replace whole egg based on the protein content. And typically what we found is that it's possible to replace 100% of the whole egg with a WPC80, and typically you're going to add some water and you might replace the water, of course, that was in the egg. If you're using a real whole egg, if you use a powdered egg, it's not, of course, you're not going to replace any of the water there. But we often, depending on the price of eggs, are able to get a cost reduction by using WPC80. And you can make a very acceptable product from the attributes of appearance and taste and texture as well. For confections, you have a lot of opportunities in the confection area in caramels and toffee and nougats and compound coatings. And in this area, we see a lot of whey, a lot of lactose, and a lot of permeate used for those applications. Our milk and whey proteins, we see these used more in protein fortified coatings. So for high protein bars, you'll see some of the milk or whey proteins used in those coatings for that reason. Otherwise, the other ingredients, because you really are very high in lactose, you're talking about more properties that are similar to sucrose, and you're adding permeate or lactose to help actually reduce the sweetness. So you're getting the same performance, the same characteristics that sucrose would have, but with less sweetness. So lots of possibilities here in confections. In nutrition bars, here we're usually focusing more on protein. So you will probably end up looking at ingredients like whey protein concentrates, whey protein isolates, milk protein concentrates, and milk protein isolates, and maybe even hydrolysates. There's been a lot of bar work done over the years at different universities, and typically you're looking for ingredients that can help prevent bar hardening, right? So the higher in protein you go, the more potential for bar hardening you have. So besides you adding protein, which is the nutritional focus you have for a high protein bar, you're looking for something that can provide still a very good texture and good flavor. So at our center, a few years ago, we actually did some bar work, and we made up a very model-like system for this bar research. And we decided to use a 40-30-30 bar, which means you have 40% of your carbohydrates, 40% of your calories from carbohydrates, 30% of your calories from protein, and 30% from fat. And this very simple system had the protein ingredient, it had some canola oil, and it had some fructose syrup. And in this study, we looked at 30 different types of proteins. And this was really a study to focus on dairy proteins and how they compared with different plant proteins. So very briefly, because we don't have time to explain the whole study in detail, our milk proteins are at the top of the slide. So you have milk protein concentrates and isolates and micellar casings. Our whey proteins are in the middle. So you have whey protein concentrates and whey protein isolates there. And the plant proteins are at the bottom. And the plant proteins were pea, potato, rice, and also all of these proteins were, you notice, very, very different in terms of their appearance. Some of them are very dark. A couple of the potato proteins were very dark in color. The rice protein was very dark in color. And the pea and the soy were probably a little more similar in terms of their color, more tan, maybe slightly brown. The whey proteins, of course, are more tan, and the milk proteins are very white. And we made up these bars, put them in metallized foil, and stored them at room temperature for some of the storage conditions. And you'll see that even after 90 days of storage, they developed quite a bit of color over time. So you don't, just because you don't store them at hot temperatures, doesn't mean that they quit. They actually will keep changing in color. So here, there's our milk, our whey, and our plant. And if you look at the bar hardness, now day 1 is in blue, and 3 months is in red. And we measured bar hardness using a texture analyzer, and you can see the difference between the milk protein samples, the whey protein samples, and the plant protein samples. And actually, you have some very high differences in hardness with our plant proteins. So the pea, especially in the potato protein bars, got very hard after 3 months. Our milk proteins were kind of in between, and our whey proteins actually had the least amount of hardness develop over time. So some very interesting data, and it just helps you to understand that different sources of protein will provide much different textural attributes in a bar. And also the flavors of these were quite different as well. So the line I've drawn for you is to show you that at 15 nanometers, the bar hardness is actually, or underneath 15 newtons, I should say, the bar hardness is actually pretty good. It would be acceptable to most consumers. So above that line would be what we would call an unacceptable level of hardness. I have to finish up just with a couple of resources for you. There are some very nice resources on the thinkusadairy.org website, and some newer ones that are focused on ready-to-drink beverages, also on overall heat stability. One that talks about functionality and the composition of all the ingredients that we talked about. So it's a really nice, concise guide to help you choose the ingredient you're looking for. And then we also have a new technical monograph that focuses on yogurt and how to use some of these dairy ingredients in yogurt. So with that, I would like to thank you for attending. I hope you learned something. I hope you find a lot of new opportunities to use dairy ingredients in your product development work. I'd like to thank the U.S. Dairy Export Council for having me be a part of this training for you. And I especially like to thank the Dairy Farmers of Wisconsin and the National Dairy Council for the funding that they provide to our center, because without their support and their funding, I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be able to do these things for you. So I appreciate your attention and your time, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. And best wishes on all your new product development. So thank you.
Thank you, KJ, for sharing your valuable insights. Today's functionality overview showcased the truly unique versatility of U.S. dairy ingredients, especially dairy proteins. All proteins are not created equal, and no other type of protein ingredient offers the range of specific and quantifiable benefits provided by nutritious, minimally processed, mild-flavored U.S. dairy proteins. We're also very proud of our sustainability story, which is a cycle that starts with the U.S. dairy farmers' commitment to unparalleled care and management of their cows to reduce the carbon footprint. The United States is one of the largest milk producers in the world, with the average U.S. cow producing 4 times more milk than the average global cow. This greater per-cow productivity results in the U.S. having the smallest greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk produced compared to other regions in the world. In closing, I'd like to emphasize a USDEC resource that KJ mentioned entitled Dairy Ingredients Functionality and Composition Reference Guide. This free report can be found at thinkusadairy.org and is filled with guidance on how to select the right U.S. dairy ingredient across a wide range of food and beverage applications. USDEC and the U.S. dairy industry are your innovation partners, and our offices around the world are ready to assist you in a variety of ways, such as providing formulation and application ideas, technical support, and also in identifying dairy ingredient suppliers to meet your specific needs. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar today. We hope you found it useful.
Então, como sempre, para quem está sempre com a gente nos webinars, nós vamos conduzir agora uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. E eu tenho alguns comentários, algumas instruções só para passar para vocês. Vocês podem mandar as suas perguntas em português mesmo, porque a gente tem um excelente trabalho simultâneo aqui das nossas intérpretes, que vão ajudar a traduzir as perguntas para as nossas conferencistas, tá? E vocês podem usar 2 canais, tanto o chat, que vocês já estão usando, eu agradeço, e também a funcionalidade de perguntas e respostas do Zoom, se vocês preferirem, tá? A gente também recebeu várias perguntas durante o momento de registros para o webinar, e também, antes de começar a sessão de perguntas e respostas, queria dizer que nós vamos disponibilizar esse material, ou seja, esse vídeo, essas apresentações para vocês, tá? Só deem uns 2 dias para a gente poder editar todo o vídeo. E também a gente vai fornecer o PowerPoint todo, né, deles, então traduzido para português e também em inglês. Então fiquem de olho nos e-mails de agradecimento do Zoom, que lá vai estar o link para download dos materiais, tá bom? Ótimo. Pessoal, vou começar aqui com algumas perguntas. A primeira eu quero fazer para KJ, e eu vou ajudar aqui a Cecília, né, nossa intérprete querida, e vou já passar para pergunta. Qual é a temperatura máxima em que se pode processar um alimento ou bebida com proteína de leite? Pode ser tanto MPC quanto WPC.
So that's a very good question. And you learned from the presentation today that milk proteins, of course, are very heat stable. So we don't have to worry about processing temperatures as much with those ingredients. But with whey proteins, we do. And the types of applications we would worry about are those that have high water contents. So beverages and yogurts, ice creams especially would be a concern. And in this case, we oftentimes, for instance, yogurt would like to heat the mix to very high temperatures, like 85 centigrade for maybe 5 to 7 minutes. This would be a very hard condition for a whey protein, especially if you were adding a lot of whey protein. So in the instance of making a high protein yogurt, often we will add 6 to 8% additional milk protein or whey protein to that mix. And if you're using whey protein, then you really do need to reduce the temperature of processing to maybe 68 to 70 degrees Celsius, just so you don't pre-denature the whey protein and cause some insolubility issues and grainy yogurt later on. So that's a good rule of thumb.
Muito obrigada, KJ. Aproveitando que você mencionou sobre iogurtes, eu tenho aqui a Darlila perguntando se você poderia, por favor, comentar um pouquinho mais sobre quais são as proteínas que devem ser aplicadas na produção de iogurte grego.
So that's also a very good question and a popular one. In the United States, there are Greek yogurts that are made by adding protein to them instead of using a separator. What you might find is that a combination of milk protein and whey proteins gives you the texture that you would like. So just remember that the more milk protein, which is predominantly casein, that you add, the thicker and the firmer that yogurt will become. If you combine a little bit of whey protein with that, your texture will soften, and it might be a little bit more acceptable for some of your consumers. So I would suggest that you try both, and maybe try milk protein by itself, and maybe try a combination of milk protein and whey protein to see what texture you like.
Muito obrigada, KJ. Tem outra pergunta aqui do Thomas, ou Tomás, me perdoa se eu estou pronunciando errado. Ele pergunta por que na maioria das bebidas com alto teor de proteína, geralmente a gente percebe que elas não têm lactose. Poderia comentar um pouco sobre isso?
It could be that in your market, the manufacturers of those ingredients have decided that lactose-free is very appealing and a much better approach for your market. But sometimes even in the US, we see that they are lactose-free. And some of that is because people would like to see less sugar in their products overall, and the lactose contributes to the sugar content. Or maybe they're making that product for the athletic market, and oftentimes athletes prefer products to not have lactose in them, especially if they think they might be ingesting them during their workout. They want to make sure they don't have any gastrointestinal issues, perhaps. So there could be many reasons why they're lactose-free.
Ok, obrigada. Tem uma outra pergunta aqui da Giovana. Qual que é a relação das proteínas utilizadas e da dureza das barras proteicas? Existe alguma relação? Qual foi a aplicação sensorialmente mais aceitável? E tem uma terceira pergunta. Nesse caso de barras proteicas, qual seria a proteína vegetal menos aceitável? Eu acho que é um bom gancho também para a gente mencionar sobre proteínas vegetais. Talvez a Terry possa também comentar. Enfim, é um combo, 3 em 1.
Okay, so I will address the bar hardness issue. So bar hardness is usually directly related to the level of protein that you add. So the more protein that you add, and it doesn't matter if it's plant or dairy, the harder the bar will get over time. Now, in the graph that I showed you, you will notice that whey proteins typically maintained a softer temperature throughout the shelf life as compared to milk protein, and definitely as compared to plant proteins. So pea proteins, and there were 4 different pea proteins in the study, tended to develop much harder textures over time. So I would probably avoid perhaps using pea protein as a plant source. Now, the other thing to note is that the textural attributes, besides hardness, are also very important. When you use whey proteins, though they become harder, they usually have a more chewy texture to them, and milk proteins will have a much drier and a shorter texture, so that the product will break much more easily. And I will say the plant proteins were more similar to the milk proteins. They tended to be drier, more powdery, and actually had a very short texture. So just some things to remember. I think sometimes that's why you also see combinations of proteins in bar applications, because they all have a little bit different texture characteristics.
Terry, talvez você queira comentar um pouco sobre proteínas lácteas do leite de vaca versus proteínas vegetais. Eu acho que seria um bom complemento.
Sure. Thanks, Carolina. So obviously we talked a lot about functionality during this presentation, and dairy proteins have exceptional functionality, many different areas, which KJ covered. But there are other advantages to using dairy proteins versus plant proteins other than functionality. And really important one is nutrition. Dairy proteins are complete proteins, which mean that they contain all of the essential amino acids that are required for human nutrition. They have the highest protein quality scores, and higher than all plant proteins. The only plant protein that even comes close is soy. So from a nutrition standpoint, you can formulate with dairy proteins, and you can use less because it takes less to achieve your nutrition goals. Another point I'll mention is related to flavor. So dairy proteins have very mild, clean, let's say milky type flavor, and they don't have significant off flavors that you need to use masking ingredients to cover up. So this is unlike many plant proteins, which do have, which maybe have bitter flavors or just flavors that are not desirable in your application. And the last one I'll mention is related to processing. Dairy proteins are made by filtration, which is just a physical separation. And so it's a very simple process. So from that standpoint, they're considered to be minimally processed. And we have some data to support that. So in 2020, a study was conducted comparing dairy and plant proteins related to the degree of processing, and especially on impact on environmental resources, starting from post-harvest through to the production of the finished dry powder. And there were a number of key learnings. I'll mention a few of them. So one, very important, processing of plant proteins may require the use of processing aids beyond simply water. So we're talking here about acids, bases, salts, caustic agents, versus processing of dairy proteins, which with very few exceptions, we're really just talking about using water to physically separate the components. The other point I'll mention is that in this physical separation, so isolating and purifying the protein, which that's going to be required no matter what type of protein you're making, plant, dairy, insect, whatever it is, you have these separation steps. And so when you separate the protein, then you have non-protein ingredients as well. And you need to find a home for those, whether you can find ways to utilize them, or in some cases they need to be disposed of. In the case of making dairy proteins, the co-products of dairy proteins tend to find more value-added uses than those of plant proteins. So here we're talking about things like permeate and lactose, which KJ mentioned, These have very valuable uses as well. So when you're making dairy proteins, nothing goes to waste. All the parts of milk are put to good use. And that's a really important point in today's world. So those are some of the main things that it's important to know.
Ok, muito obrigada, Terry. Antes da gente prosseguir, gente, vocês estão mandando várias perguntas aqui, muito legal o engajamento, mas eu queria lembrar que não vai dar tempo de responder todas, mas responderemos por e-mail depois, tá bom? A gente tem o e-mail de vocês de registro, então a gente vai encaminhar a resposta. Próxima pergunta. Do José Roberto. Primeiro, devido ao problema de estabilidade das proteínas frente a altas temperaturas, vocês comentaram sobre a redução da temperatura de pasteurização, mencionando que seja inferior a 70 graus Celsius. Agora a pergunta: como fica a questão do controle microbiológico frente às temperaturas mais baixas?
Okay, so that's a good question. And I think I really talked about yogurt, for instance, and the 70 degrees C is still sufficient for pasteurization of a yogurt mix. So I wouldn't be worried about the microbiological issues with that product. With beverages, it's a little different story. Again, we're probably not going to make a whey protein beverage that is designed for UHT processing. The products that I showed you that were low acid beverages were predominantly milk protein focused. So they used a milk protein concentrate or milk protein isolate, sometimes a caseinate ingredient. And if they had whey protein in them at all, it would have been a very low amount. So what I recommend for UHT beverages, so you don't have to compromise the processing temperatures, is to always make sure you have a lot more casein protein in your system than you do whey protein. So typically, if you're using an MPC, you'll have 80% protein and 20% whey protein, right? So you can go a little bit higher than that, but casein still needs to be the predominant protein. And then you won't have to compromise your processing conditions. So yogurt is the only one that I recommended reducing the temperature. And that's only in the case of a high protein yogurt where you want to use predominantly whey protein. So for all of these applications, if you have more casein than whey protein, you should not need to reduce your pasteurization temperatures at all.
Muito claro. Muito obrigada, KJ. Outra pergunta. Primeiro, do Guilhermo Navarro. Primeiro, ele agradece pela ótima apresentação. E a pergunta é: para um suco de frutas com alto teor de proteína, bebida ácida, com pH de 3,5 e pasteurizada, precisaria usar homogeneização ou seria possível estabilizá-la sem homogeneizador?
So at pH 3.5, especially if you're using a whey protein isolate, you should be able to process it without any additional stabilizer. Pectin usually is the stabilizer of choice for those products, and always a high methoxypectin. And most of those hydrocolloids won't function very well once they get below pH 3.5 anyway. So I would suggest trying without the stabilizer first to see what kind of stability you get. If you're using a WPC 80, you may have a few more issues with settling, primarily because there will be some denatured whey protein in most whey protein concentrates with 80% protein. And in an acid system, they might precipitate a little bit. But if you use a whey protein isolate, you won't have that issue because the microfiltration process removes any denatured proteins from that system. And what you will have there should be very soluble and have very good solubility at pH 3.5.
Ok, muito obrigada. Vou para uma outra pergunta do Luciano dessa vez. Ele já fez a pergunta em inglês, eu acho que eu vou inverter. Primeiro eu vou fazer em inglês, depois eu venho para português, porque eu tenho que traduzir aqui na minha cabeça. How can we avoid synersis in a milk beverage or yogurt when using high amount of a whey protein blended with a low amount of milk protein in a recipe? Shall we get the casein higher? Pergunta agora em português, deixa eu tentar traduzir. Ou vocês já traduziram, meninas? Como que a gente pode evitar a serenesis numa bebida láctea ou iogurte quando usando um alto teor de proteína ou de whey protein, sinerese? Ou se a gente deve subir o teor de caseína. Ótimo.
So yogurt beverages, and I think the question is related to yogurt beverages or just beverages in general, is that right?
Milk beverage or yogurt.
Milk beverage or yogurt. So in milk beverages, we don't usually see issues with syneresis. I'm imagining that you're talking about either a pasteurized milk beverage or a UHT processed milk beverage. Usually we don't have that issue. In yogurts we do, and sometimes in yogurt beverages we do. So I think because a yogurt beverage is usually lower in solids anyway, and yogurt beverages, it's common to have issues with syneresis because of the low solids and the lower stability. So I would recommend that you might actually need a hydrocolloid in a yogurt beverage system to help sort of hold everything together and also interact with some of the proteins. But using a whey protein in a yogurt beverage will help with some of that syneresis. But just realize the more protein you add in yogurt beverage, especially if you added milk protein, it will get much thicker. So we have high protein yogurt beverages in the US, some that are fortified with whey protein and some that are very high in just milk protein in general. And those products with milk protein are usually much more thick than the product with whey protein. Both should help reduce syneresis, but just realize that the textural differences will be pretty big.
Obrigada, KJ. A gente tem mais duas perguntas super interessantes aqui. Bom, a primeira. Durante a fabricação de um requeijão, que é um cheese spread, que a gente tem aqui no Brasil, muito típico, ou cream cheese, qual ingrediente vocês recomendam? Seria um WPC ou um MPC?
So first of all, it'd be interesting to know if this is a recombined product or if it is you're just adding a milk protein or a whey protein to your fluid milk.
Fluid milk, may I add that?
Okay, made with fluid milk. And I'm thinking this product, since I haven't had it, is it very soft texture like a cream cheese or even softer than a cream cheese?
Softer, much softer.
Softer than a cream cheese. So kind of the same thing here as yogurt. The more milk protein that you add, I think the thicker and firmer the texture will be. Adding more whey protein will allow better water binding, but also should give you a pretty smooth texture and a softer texture. So that would be my recommendation, but I would experiment a little bit with that. You may find that a combination also might work for you as well.
Ok. Eu sei que eu falei que tinha duas, mas talvez a gente continue com duas. Eu queria que você comentasse, KJ, sobre a possibilidade de uso de ingredientes lácteos. Na verdade, a pergunta é sobre uso de proteína láctea na produção de cerveja.
Oh, so I don't get this question a lot. There has been some research articles, I think, that have used proteins or whey proteins in beer, though I have not seen any commercial products or heard of any commercial products in the United States. It should be possible. So I think you can definitely try it. I don't know, maybe there are consumers that are interested in a high protein beer, but I don't know. So I think it should work if you really want to try it.
A gente tinha comentado também sobre a possibilidade de uso de lactose permeado. Isso seria possível, com certeza.
So yes, in the US, we do have beer manufacturers that use lactose in their beer production. And they usually are using it to make what we would call a milk stout. There are quite a few of them around, and because I live in Wisconsin, they're probably even more common here. But they will use lactose as a part of the fermentation and then add organisms that will use the lactose in the beer manufacture. So you get, I wouldn't say it's a milky flavor, but you definitely get a different flavor in that beer.
Ok, thank you. Agora sim a última, porque a gente já está bem prolongado aqui o tempo de webinar, muito interessante a discussão. Pergunta da Marisa. Ela diz assim, considerando o perfil técnico do WPC 80, quais as principais aplicações que você indicaria para potencializar os benefícios desse ingrediente?
So a WPC 80 could be used in almost any application. Really, it's your imagination that is the only limitation here. I would say the only reason that you might not want to use it, as we talked about, is if you're trying to make a clear beverage, it will not be able to make a clear beverage because of the fat content. And if you want to declare lactose free, using a WPC 80 won't allow you to do that because there is some lactose in the ingredient itself. But otherwise, it's a very versatile ingredient, and I would say in most applications, it will work very well.
Muito obrigada. Pessoal, eu sei que é um pouquinho chato a gente encerrar assim, a sessão de perguntas e respostas. A gente tem ainda uma lista gigante, mas reforço, vamos responder por e-mail, tá? A gente pode mudar o slide. Eu quero, antes de encerrar o webinar, deixar para vocês esses endereços de e-mail para que vocês também escrevam perguntando, enfim, coisas adicionais. E a gente também acabou de mandar aqui no chat exatamente todos os links. Então, a gente convida vocês a visitarem o site thinkusadairy.org. Inclusive, a página ela é traduzida para o português, então fica, inclusive, mais fácil. Bom, o e-mail da KJ, o e-mail da Terry, também tem o e-mail do nosso escritório, usdec@riverglobal.net. Tá? Pode passar o slide. E aí, agora, eu gostaria que todos vocês que ficaram ainda com a gente, se pudessem, por gentileza, responder a nossa última pergunta, que seria a avaliação sobre esse webinar, a gente agradeceria muitíssimo, que vai sempre ajudar a gente a melhorar a qualidade, né, do conteúdo. De novo, peço desculpas por todos os problemas técnicos. Enquanto isso, a gente pode mudar o slide também, porque daqui a pouquinho eu vou fechar o pool. eu quero também convidá-los para o nosso próximo webinar. Vai ser o último da série de 4 webinars que a gente tem organizado, né, ao longo desses últimos meses aqui no Brasil. E da próxima vez a gente vai falar sobre nutrição, exatamente relacionada ao consumo de alimentos e bebidas com ingredientes lácteos, mas a gente, aqui no Brasil, a gente associa muito, né, a nutrição esportiva isso, só que eu acho que o seminário ele vai oferecer na verdade, vai abrir um pouquinho a nossa cabeça de como isso pode ser um grande fator nutricional para todas as idades e tipos de alimentação, tá? Então, bom, só estou compartilhando aqui os resultados com vocês. Muito obrigada pela avaliação. E, peraí, falando... terminei. Volta o slide com os dados do webinar, mais fácil. Então, ingredientes lácteos para nutrição saudável em todas as idades. Dia 17 de novembro, é uma terça-feira, mesmo horário, 10 horas da manhã, tá? Inscrições, site www.lácteoseua.com. Tem também o site aqui na mensagem do chat que a Clarice acabou de mandar a todos, tá? Bom, pessoal, agora a gente vai para as considerações finais. Eu vou deixar a KJ e a Terry se despedirem de vocês. E eu gostaria, primeiro, de agradecer muito a todos que estiveram aqui conosco. E, de novo, obrigada. Desculpas pelos problemas técnicos. Espero que tenha sido produtivo. Terry, por favor.
Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate it. Hope you learned more about dairy ingredients. And in the beginning survey, most people were interested in using dairy ingredients in dairy applications, but hopefully you learned that dairy ingredients can be used in many, many different types of foods and beverages. As KJ said, your imagination is the only limit. So any questions, please let us know. Thanks.
Obrigada, Terry. KJ?
Yes, thank you, everyone. I really wish I could have been there to meet you all and be present for a live presentation. Someday, maybe I hope to get to Brazil instead of only visiting virtually. I hope that you learned a lot from this presentation, and I encourage you, if you have more questions, to follow up with one of us, and we would be very happy to answer them as best that we can. So good luck with all your product development, and thank you for attending.
Obrigada, muito obrigada. Bom, a todos, encorajo a trabalharem com ingredientes dos Estados Unidos, a nos procurarem, caso vocês tiverem dúvidas nas formulações. De novo, o webinar dia 17, e lembrete, vamos enviar todo o material, esse vídeo desse webinar para vocês por e-mail. Obrigada, vejo todos vocês em 2 semanas. Tchau!